Hello, we are on live now. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
We're
Yes,
on
can
live.
you? Yeah, I see it on YouTube, but I don't see the screen I'm sharing in the room. I'm seeing
I don't see a screen in the room. I see a black space.
on the laptop. I am
Yeah, but
sharing
look at the screen. Look at the screens in front of you. What do you see in the screens in front of you?
the holding slide.
And what do you see in the screen?
Now I see myself. Now I see your.
But they have to switch from the screen. Once they start presenting, they switch to the WebEx will switch to the screens. At the moment, I don't see the screens either. But they do switch
How do we know how the switch will
from
happen?
the control room.
The AV team will do that. Okay,
Yeah,
now
I can see screen. I can see live stream starts on Thursday 19th. You see
okay.
that? Do you see that?
I see it in this. Okay, now I see it on YouTube. It's fine.
Okay, I leave it
Yes.
open and I leave it as it is now. Okay.
Yes, please. Yes.
You're welcome.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a great pleasure for us to host this 78th Economic Policy Panel meeting here at Banco de España, also in a context in which Spain is holding the presidency of the European Union. Indeed, over the last few months, in the context of this presidency, we have had the pleasure to collaborate with the Spanish government in many institutional events, some of them hosted here at Banco de España, and this has given us the opportunity to have very interesting discussions with a wide variety of counterparts. No? Just to give you some examples, in late September, we collaborated with the Spanish government in preparing the informal ECOFIN meeting that took place in Santiago de Compostela. And in that meeting, perhaps the most interesting part of the discussion was the discussion between ministers, economic ministers, finance ministers, and central bank governors in terms of the most adequate policy mix, the policy mix between monetary policy and fiscal policy in the current juncture. Obviously, we don't need to get to an agreement, but the discussion is already fruitful and enriching. And another example was, again, a collaboration with the Spanish government to prepare the informal EFC meeting that took place also in Madrid at the beginning of in October, and we host part of the meeting here in our premises. And in that event, well, there were many interesting discussions as always, but I was very pleased with the discussion about between academics, between governments, and between central bankers on implications of the new technologies, and in particular artificial intelligence on labor market dynamics, current and future labor market dynamics. So very interesting discussion there. And finally, another example is just a few days ago, we had here in this same room, we hosted the informal meeting of the financial counselors of the European Union. These are people that are very devoted to designing and actually approving the regulation of the European Union. So in that meeting, we again had, and my colleagues, some of my colleagues here had the opportunity to discuss with them issues, well, the most challenging issues for the euro area looking ahead. In particular, we put a lot of emphasis on the strategic autonomy of the European Union. Eventually, to conclude that, as we have been suggested quite often, we need more Europe, and we need to strengthen the institutional infrastructure of Europe in many dimensions. No? But well, after these comments about the past, just to show you that we have been very busy over the last few weeks, let's focus on today's event, which I think is a perfect complement to the other events that I have mentioned. You know, it's a perfect complement in the sense that we will be able to have, or I expect to have, very promising discussions and very fruitful discussions about the state-of-the-art research, which more importantly, it is very relevant. It has immediate implications for the day-to-day questions that a central bank like us is confronting every day in our day-to-day business. No. So, and in this regard, I was very pleased when I saw the program for the first time to see that many, if not all, of the papers in the program, in the agenda, are providing very helpful insights on the very specific questions that we are addressing nowadays. So very critical questions that we are addressing nowadays, and consistent with that, actually many of the papers interact very nicely, and I'm sure that my colleagues, that many of them will act as a discussion during the agenda, will make sure that you know about our work in many of the fronts. No, but let me give you some examples, some areas where I see a very clear overlap between the program today and our research agenda, our analytical priorities at Banco de España. No? And please forgive me all of those that will be presenting things that I am not going to mention, but it's just because I want to give some time for the discussions and the presentation, no? Which are the interesting part, not my opening remarks. So there is going to be a couple of papers in the agenda that will be presented today and tomorrow on gender inequality. This is an area where researchers at Banco de España has worked and keep working a lot. I'm seeing Laura here, Carlos Sanz, Olimpia Bover, many people at the Bank of Spain working on issues related to gender inequality. Just to give you some examples, actually Laura, Olimpia, I believe, have shown that there is a gender wage gap at the level of the ECB staff, and part of this gender wage gap has to do with gender differences in the probability of promotion. So we have done that for the ECB. It makes sense to keep doing this job for our institution. In our institution, and let me give you the exact numbers, otherwise. In our institution, female representation has gone up significantly over the last few years. They represented 37% of the staff in 2000, and they represent now 53% in 2022. But still, in terms of management positions, we have not arrived to parity. So that's why Laura and other colleagues are working in trying to understand if there is any gender difference in the career path of within the Bank of Spain, and I hope we will have results soon. Never soon enough, but soon. Also on gender inequality, also Laura, Carlos have published a paper recently showing what is the child penalty in Spain, and they show that, again, I don't want to make a mistake with the numbers, they show that after the first child is born, mothers' annual earnings drop by 11% in Spain, while men's annual earnings remain unchanged. And this is in the first year, but with a longer term perspective, this child penalty is equivalent to 28%, a gap of 28%, which is a similar gap to the one that has been identified in other papers in the literature for countries like Denmark, Finland, Sweden, or the US. But again, we have many papers on this area. We have papers showing gender discrimination in terms of credit markets. We have showing discrimination also in papers accepted in very large European economic conferences. I don't know if this is the case in this conference. The organizers will tell me. But well, to end this first block on a positive note, work by Laura, also by Juan Mora, show that in Spain, in one of our latest working papers in Spain, the amount of regulation that has been deployed in terms of addressing gender inequality issues, diversity issues, seems to have a positive correlation with female participation in the labor market and employment. So this is to say that we have identified some issues, but we can. There are ways to solve these issues. No, we have identified ways of reducing these inequalities. Well, a second area that will be covered extensively today, and that it overlaps a lot with our research agenda, has to do with fiscal policy. I don't know if you know, but it is the opinion of the Bank of Spain that over the next few years, the Spanish economy should need to undertake a gradual but ambitious fiscal consolidation process to help to reinforce the sustainability of our public accounts. And this fiscal consolidation process will need to incorporate measures both on the expenditure side and on the revenue side. A couple of papers that will be discussed in the program in the next few sessions will address issues related with policies on the revenue side, both related with international coordination of taxes and also related with the distributional effects of taxes. No? And in this regard, we have been emphasizing, and we have several words in this line, in the line of showing that it is important for the Spanish economy to undertake an holistic assessment of all the designs, all the elements in the design of all our tax instruments, and to analyze them both from the perspective of the growth implication of these elements in the design of the taxes, but also in terms of the distributional implications. A third topic is related. I think Romain will present a paper on this, on the political economy of structural reforms. One message that we have emphasized in our annual report published in May is that in terms of GDP per capita over the last few decades, the Spanish economy has been unable to converge to the euro area average. And this, in our view, and in the annual report we provide more details, this in our view calls for the implementation in over the next few years of an ambitious structural reform program. No? But then one thing is thinking of that, and then there is the design, and then there is the implementation phase. And as the paper by Romain and co-authors emphasize, this has to do with is very heavily influenced by political economic consideration, by beliefs, and the like. And in this topic, we are also working. One of my colleagues, Carlos Sanz, has a paper that shows, for instance, that using an online experiment in the context of the COVID pandemic, he shows that. Let me be very precise. That the beliefs about the government performance had significant effects on the trust of citizens about the government, about the political accountability, and even in more practical terms, these beliefs influence how prone citizens are, for instance, to accept vaccination. No? So political economy issues and beliefs and priors are. We cannot be naive, need to be taken into account in order to think about the implementation of structural reforms in the future. Last but not least, among these 4 areas where I see very clear overlap, I see overlaps everywhere, no? But where I see very clear overlaps is on the papers that will be presented, I think, tomorrow, on the distributional effects of the energy transition and the spikes in energy prices. Over the last few years, we have devoted quite an amount of resources to study both the implications, the wide variety of implications for the economy, for the financial sector, for the central banks of climate change, and also more recently the implications of this significant spike in 2021 and half of 2022 in energy prices. No, most of this research we have summarized it in 2 thematic chapters in the annual reports in 2021 and 2022. But if I may, one of the most important lessons that we have extracted of this research is that this climate transition, this energy transition, is going to have very large distributional effects on sectors, on regions, on households, and on firms. And let's be clear, unless these distributional implications are identified and are properly addressed by public policies, it is very likely that the ecological transition will not materialize with the intensity and with the speed that is going to be required in order to meet the very ambitious net zero targets that we had ahead. No? Talking about these distributional consequences of shocks or structural trends, more recently we have worked a lot in identifying these distributional impacts of this high inflation episode that we have lived over the last few quarters, and also of the increasing interest rates. And again, we have identified very large differences across firms and also across households, depending on the level of rent, depending on the level of education, on many dimensions. No? And as we have emphasized in many of our latest reports, it is very important, it is critical that public policies take into account these distributional implications in order to be well designed and well targeted. And in many cases, it is important that public policies, that fiscal policies in Spain and in Europe and in many other countries are very, in order to be efficient, are very targeted and focus on the most vulnerable groups. Well, before concluding my remarks, obviously I would like to thank all of you that have made the event possible, and in particular, a special thanks to Mariolina and to Despoina, who have organized the event on the side of the economic policy and CPR, and to Mati on the side of Banco de España. Of course, thanks also to all the speakers, to all the discussions and panelists, and to all the invisible hands, Philippe, Eva, that have participated in designing the program and coordinating the job. No? And well, I finish by wishing you all very, very fruitful and rich discussion over the next day and a half. And thanks again for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angel, and I take this opportunity to thank you for accepting to host this event. There's actually a long tradition of the Bank of Spain cooperating with CEPR. I don't know the number of events that have been co-organized by the Bank of Spain and CEPR, but there are many of them. And I really want to thank you, thank the staff also of the Bank of Spain. And this was done, actually, I have to insist, in a very little time, so it was super responsive and super efficient. Okay, so I'm Philippe Martin. I'm actually stepping in as one of the managing editors of economic policy. The other two managing editors are stranded in a plane, but they're actually going to arrive I think in the next hour, so they should come in also. So we have a very good list of papers, and Angel has alluded to some of them. We're going to start with COVID papers. Two papers. The first one will be presented by Sophie Piton. So the rules of the game are super simple. We have 60 minutes for the two papers, each of the papers, 25 minutes presentation, 10 minutes for each discussant, and I hope a very lively discussion with the panel. So Sophie, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm just going to check that this is working. Yes, perfect. So thank you very much for putting our paper on the program and for the discussants to accept to discuss this paper. So the paper I'm going to present today actually started as a policy project at the Bank of England to track the effect of the pandemic in real time. So it looks at business creation during the COVID-19 pandemic, but we thought that we uncovered quite interesting facts that were worth putting into a paper. So it is joint work with Salim Bahaj from UCL and with Anthony Savagar from the University of Kent. So I'm from the Bank of England, so the usual disclaimer applies. These are our views, not the view of the bank or any of its committee. So let me start with a short motivation. So entry has, there's a lot of papers showing that entry has longer implications for employment, for productivity. And we think that entry is quite interesting to look at during the pandemic because firm entry is usually pro-cyclical, so it declines during recessions. And that's what we saw during the global financial crisis, where we saw a missing generation of startups that led to a very slow recovery in employment. But the story during the pandemic is quite different. What we saw is that the pandemic inspired many new entrepreneurs to start businesses. And so we've seen a surge in business creation during the pandemic. So that's what I call resilience in firm entry here. And so this resilience in firm entry has already been documented by John Haltiwanger, in a few papers co-authored by John Haltiwanger in the US, as well as the OECD for a broader range of economists. But I think that this figure here summarizes well the evidence. So I'll focus on the UK, that's the black line. And what this figure shows is the path of cumulative business applications during the COVID period on the right, and compares the past with the global financial crisis on the left. So it shows this path relative to a reference period. So the reference period is 2018 for COVID and 2006 for the global financial crisis. And so all deviations from the month zero of the crisis. And what you can see is that during the global financial crisis, the path of corporate business applications, the growth rate of new business creation actually collapsed and then rose slowly in the subsequent recovery. But during the pandemic, business creation actually declined quite a lot during the first lockdown, but then rebounded such that it reached its reference level of activity within 3 months. And a year within the crisis, it was already well above its reference level of activity. So the contrast between the COVID episode and the global financial crisis is very stark. And this is not UK specific. You see a similar, very striking contrast in the US, that's a blue line, and in French data as well, that's a green line. So this is surprising because, as I've already mentioned, there's already a literature showing that firm entry is usually procyclical, so rises in booms, declines in recessions. And if we look at historical data that we're able to have in the UK, so we can have, oops, here. So we can have firm entry since 1900. So what you see here is the number of firms being created every year, detrended. And what you can see is that for each recession episode, so the gray shaded area, firm entry actually declined. The only times where firm entry increased during the recession were the 2 post-war periods and the COVID-19 period. So we call these specific, so that's the red shaded areas here. So we call these 3 recessions the extreme event recessions, and actually it corresponds to large shocks that forced the economy to restructure, so consumer demand to shift to some sectors and producer supply, so some shifts to consumer demand and producer supply. So if you think of the post-war period, this corresponds to the end of the contraction period during the war and to the restarting of private enterprises after the war ended. And if you think of COVID, this corresponds to a reallocation of the shift in demand towards lockdown compliant sectors. So very specific times. So what we do in this paper is we dig in some very granular data we have in the UK that was at the time very real time on business creation to understand the drivers and macroeconomic impacts of this resilience in firm entry. And also that helps us inform on how rapidly did the economy adjust to such a large shock as COVID. So, but what we do in a bit more detail, so we start by documenting 4 additional facts to the facts that I've already presented. So I'll show you that the new firms that were created were disproportionately concentrated in the online retail sector. And the new firms were also started by individuals, what we call solo entrepreneurs, so single individuals who didn't have any prior experience in entrepreneurship. So starting up their first business during the pandemic. I'm also going to show you that firm entry was mirroring very closely the collapse in movements to retail and recreation locations. So really reflecting this shift from brick and mortar to online retail. And that actually firm entry responds quite quickly to a decrease in the measures of footfall. And then we're going to ask whether these new businesses that were created had any real impact on the economy. Are they economically relevant? And so to do so, we're going to use additional data on online job postings first to have a sense of whether these firms have an intention to employ people and become employer firms. And what I'm going to show you is that actually these new firms do intend to employ people, but they do so at a lower rate than firms that were born pre-COVID. So they are less likely to become employer firms than firms that were born pre-COVID. And finally, we also investigate whether these firms survive. And so we also exploit data on firm dissolutions, and we show that the firms are also more likely to dissolve within 2 years of existence than firms that were born pre-COVID. So once we have all of these facts, we plug all these facts into a statistical framework to have a sense of what is the aggregate employment impact from the firms that were created during COVID. And what we find is that even if the COVID cohort was larger than an average pre-COVID cohort, the fact that these firms are less likely to become employer firm, less likely to survive, and also have a lower growth potential means that the employment impact is actually smaller, so they create less jobs on average than the average cohort of firms pre-COVID. So it's a surprising negative impact in some way of these COVID cohort of firms. And what I'm going to show you is that most of this effect comes from the fact that most of these firms were created by new solo entrepreneurs, and these new solo entrepreneur firms tend to have a low growth potential. So the primary contributor to this limited employment impact is actually the shift in ownership composition of new entrants during the pandemic. So that's what we do in the paper. So unless there are clarifying questions, I'll just go to the meat of the paper and start by presenting the first set of facts on characterizing the businesses that were being created during the pandemic. So to gather these facts, we use data from Companies House, which is the registry of all incorporated entities in the UK. So any firm wanting to have a legal entity different from its business owner has to register with Companies House. So to open a bank account, the firm has to register to Companies House. So So it's quite different from other definitions of firm entry in the sense that these firms do not necessarily become employer firms. It's really a legal creation, legal entity. So using Companies House data, so when the firm registers, it has to indicate the postcode for its office, as well as the main sector of activity. So we can track daily entry by geographical location, as well by sector of activity. And we also track daily dissolutions. When the firm registers, it also has to declare who owns the firm, so who starts the firm, so the shareholders as well as the stakes. And so that's the information we use to categorize different types of firms depending on who owns them. And what we find that the bulk of firm creation is by individuals, single individuals, solo entrepreneurs. And within this solo entrepreneur category, we identify those that have a prior experience in entrepreneurship, so what we call serial entrepreneurs and new entrepreneurs. So those serial entrepreneurs, so those that have a prior experience in business, in entrepreneurship, we identify as individuals who started a business during the pandemic and owned at least one other business prior to the pandemic, in the 5 years prior to the pandemic. So that's our definition of serial entrepreneurs. So, but let me turn to the data. So this first figure just shows the decomposition of the increase in business creation by industry. So it shows the cumulative number of new businesses being created during COVID relative to pre-COVID, so a similar time period, and show the sectoral contributions to this increase in business creation. So in total, you can see that 140,000 more firms were created during the pandemic, and that 35,000 of them were created in the online retail sector. So online retail here is a very small sector. It's a 4-digit sector, whereas most other sectors on the figures are 2-digit sectors. So it disproportionately accounts for the rise in business creation. It accounts for 25% of business creation when it's only about 2% of the stock of firms in January 2020. So a very important sector to explain what happened during the pandemic. We then look at the monthly number of incorporations and decompose this into who started the firms. So ownership decomposition. But let me first discuss the aggregate trend. So these are the monthly number of incorporations, and the red vertical line denotes the start of the pandemic. What you can see that when the pandemic started, this number of incorporations declined during the lockdown and then rebounded, such that before the pandemic, there were on average 50,000 firms registered each month. And after the pandemic started, there were about 60,000 firms registered each month. And the bulk of this were created by new solo entrepreneurs, which is the black shaded areas here. So this was quite against our intuition, because we thought if firms are able to react so quickly to the pandemic, it must be that some existing firms open subsidiaries in online retail, and also to benefit from government support packages. But this is not what we see. What we see is that it's new solo entrepreneurs who didn't have any prior experience in entrepreneurship who mostly started these businesses during the pandemic. If we look at the online retail sector here, the facts are quite similar, but even more pronounced. So in the online retail sector, we saw an increase from 1,000 new businesses registered each month to about 3,000 businesses created each month after the pandemic started. And again, most of them were created by new solo entrepreneurs, as opposed to subsidiaries or entrepreneurs who have some experience in entrepreneurship. So a very particular kind of businesses being created. So that's the main facts characterizing the businesses that were created. But then, given the importance of the online retail sector, the question is how can we investigate how entry was related to some pandemic-driven shifts in demand or in supply. And so to investigate this question, we look at the response of firm entry to a measure of footfall to retail and location and retail and recreation places. So there were substantial variation in footfall that reflected changes in lockdown policies in the UK. And we have this measure at a very high frequency. So what we do is we use a standard local projection framework where we look at the response of the birth rate to the decline in retail footfall. So we look at the response of the birth rate within a week T and at about a 20-week horizon H. We include both 4 lags of footfall and birth rate, so quite a standard local projection framework. For the footfall, we use the measure that was provided by Google. So Google provided different measures of mobility during the pandemic, all defined. So there were daily indices, and they were defined as deviations relative to the first few weeks of 2020. And so we define the birth rate in a similar way, where we look at entry relative to the total number of firms in January 2020. And we annualize this birth rate. So these are the estimated coefficients from these local projections. So you can see the response for the total economy on the left and on the left, and online retail on the right. So the online retail is a contribution to the total, hence why the difference in the scale. And what you can see is that entry actually responds quite quickly to the decline in the footfall indicator, and within about 9 weeks. So the peak answer is at about 9 weeks. That's for the total economy, and for the online retail, it responds a bit faster, but also with a peak response at about 9 weeks. So to make sense of this number, we then create a counterfactual birth rate absent any footfall shock. And so we look at the cumulative answer over the pandemic period. We convert this birth rate in terms of number of businesses, and we look at the observed cumulative number of businesses created during the pandemic, and we compare it to this counterfactual number of businesses being created absent any footfall shock. So what you see here for the black line, for instance, is the excess number of businesses being created due only to this footfall shock. The blue line is for the online retail sector only. And so what you can see there is that there were about 150,000 more businesses being created because of the footfall shock, and about 1/5 of them were created in the online retail sector. So this is very similar to the first numbers I showed you with the industry decomposition, so to the total number of firms being created during the pandemic. So I won't have time to go into details, but we also do additional exercises in the paper where we do some placebo exercises to investigate more the channels through which this happened, and we suggest that this reaction is mostly a reflection of demand shifts, because you don't see a response in entry in sectors that were either not affected by the pandemic, or sectors that were affected, sectors where you were not consistent with social distancing, like food and accommodation. And we also show that there is no response of the birth rate to other measures of mobility, like movements to park, as opposed to retail and recreation locations. So it really reflects this structural change and demand shift towards online retail, really related to lockdown policies and social distancing. So once we have this, we then turn to asking whether these new businesses that were created had any economic impact. Were they economically relevant? So as I've mentioned, unfortunately, in companies' house data, we don't have timely information on business employment. So firms have long exemptions to file accounts. So they do so quite a few years after they're born. So we don't have a way to measure their employment impact. So we had to be creative, and so we merged our firm-level data with some Indeed online job postings that were also available at the firm level. So with Indeed job postings, we're able to track the probability that a firm intends to become an employer firm, so posts a job online, and investigate whether this probability has changed for cohorts of firm born pre-COVID versus cohorts of firm born during the pandemic. So a bit of background about Indeed data. So it includes about 13 million online job postings. So it is gathered by Indeed. It includes both job postings on their own website, but also they do scrap companies' websites, so it's quite representative. And that covered the period from January 2018 to September 2022. So we had some challenge in merging the data because we don't have firm identifiers, so we had to use some algorithm to match the firms based on names. But we end up with about 13% of all employer firms in the ONS census. So it is a subsample of employer firms, but we find that it's quite representative, so it tracks quite closely the aggregate level of vacancies in the ONS vacancy survey, and also in terms of industry composition is very similar to what we see in the ONS vacancy survey. So a small sample, but quite representative. So I'll only have time to show you this very simple statistic where we look at the probability that the firms post an online job, so posts a job online as the firm age for different cohorts of firms. So the firms born during the pandemic in blue and the firms born pre-pandemic in black. So if I focus on quarter 8, so for firms after 2 years that they're born, you can see that pre-pandemic firms tend to have a probability of 2.6% to post a job online, whereas firms born during the pandemic have a probability of 2.3. So that's about 13, if I'm remembering correctly, 13% decline in the probability to post a job online or to intend to become an employer firm for firms that are born during COVID. So in the paper, we also do additional robustness checks. We make sure this is not driven by different labor market conditions that firms are facing, whether they were born pre-pandemic or during the pandemic. And we also look at whether this is driven by the industry composition, but the results always carry through, and firms born during the pandemic always are less likely to become employer firms than firms born pre-pandemic. We finally do a very similar exercise, but this time exploiting the dissolution data and looking at survival rates. And so this figure plots in a very similar way the cumulative share of firms dissolving as firms age for the average cohort of firms born pre-COVID in black and firms born during the pandemic in blue. And what you can see is that the blue line is above the black line, meaning that firms born during the pandemic are more likely to dissolve within 2 years than firms born pre-pandemic. So again, we also check whether this is driven by the industry composition, and this is not the case. Results carry through. So once we have all of these facts together, we plug them into a statistical framework and ask what are the aggregate employment impacts. So the framework is quite simple. So what we do is compare the number of jobs being created for a cohort of firms born in period I, so either pre-COVID or during COVID, as firm reach age A. And so we can decompose this job creation into an extensive margin, so how likely the firm is to survive by age A, and an intensive margin, which is conditional on surviving, how much this firm will grow by age A. So we calibrate this using the facts that I've presented. So N is the number of entrants, so corresponding to facts 1 and 2 that I've presented. Delta, so the survival rate, is also a function of the dissolution rate, so we can just use the last fact that I've presented. For the intensive margin, then it gets a bit more tricky. So for the probability of firms becoming employers, conditional on surviving, we do have the Indeed job postings data, but as I've mentioned, it's only a subsample. It's only 13% of all employer firms. So we have to rescale the numbers, and we use the ONS census to do so. But then we also need to know and have a sense of what the average size of this firm is at age 1 or 2, which is the horizon that we use for our projections. And this is where we have the least data. So what we'll do is use a combination of the ONS census and also the limited information we have from firms that have already declared accounts, but flagging that this is the most certain parameter. So we do also hold this factor constant as a robustness to make sure that our results hold despite the uncertainty in this firm size parameter. So this is what we get for firms as they reach age quarter 4 and quarter 8, so age 1 year and 2 years. So at a year of new firm creation pre-pandemic created about 1.3 million jobs, and you add to this about 300,000 more jobs within their second year of existence. During the COVID period, firms actually created less jobs despite the cohort being larger, because of the fact that they are less likely to survive, less likely to become employer firms, and also less likely to grow. And so this difference is within 1 year, firms born during the COVID period creates 13% less job, and within 2 years, 15% less job. So in this very simple calibration, we don't exploit the industry and ownership heterogeneity. So we then look at what if we also take into account the changing composition of industry and the rise in online retail, and what if we also look at the different composition of ownership and the rise of solo entrepreneurs. And what we find is that actually the ownership dimension is one that matters most, because it drives to a much larger decline in the number of jobs being created. So it is very important to take into account this shift towards more new solo entrepreneurs starting businesses during the pandemic to understand the employment impact. So I'll skip this robustness where we hold size fixed. It doesn't change qualitatively the results, and conclude with these few remarks. So I think we find two very interesting facts in this work. So the first one is that the booming firm registration during the pandemic didn't translate into booming employment. So it's important to not read too much into the increase in firm entry that happened during the pandemic. And the second interesting fact is that the ownership composition of this new entrant is actually an important margin that helps explain the small contribution to employment creation from these new businesses created during the pandemic. So we think that thanks to this, our paper kind of bridges two strands of the literature, because there is a few papers showing how firms starting during recessions tend to have a lower growth potential, and also some papers showing that ownership structure at startup helps explain the subsequent firm performance. And what we're suggesting here is that a changing composition of ownership over the cycle might actually help explain the lower employment recovery following recessions. And so it's also cause for further research on who starts firms with more historical data, and investigate how that changes over the cycle and how that can affect employment recoveries. So I'll stop here and leave the floor to my discussant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So Beatriz Gonzalez-Lopez is the first discussant for 10 minutes.
Do I have the pointer? Okay, should I? Okay. So thank you very much, Sophie, for your presentation, and thank you to the editors for choosing me to discuss this paper. I'm going to be very fast on this summarizing the paper. Sophie just showed you that the firm creation in the UK increased during COVID, and this seems to be especially driven by an increase in creation in online retail businesses. However, this had a very limited impact on employment. So they do a huge amount of work with data. So they are putting together data from a lot of different databases. So they have information about business registration, ownership information, employment, job posting, and retail footfall, which allows them to tackle this question from very different point of views. So this is the summary of the findings. So she just talked about this, so I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically the idea that she was highlighting is that firm entry increased during COVID in the UK, and that this was surprising because this is very different from what happened in other recessions. This is actually very similar to what happened in the US and France, as she showed. This is not what we find in Spain, for instance. In Spain, we find that during COVID, entry decreased, and this happened also in Italy and Germany, but there might be a lot of reasons for this. Entry composition tilted towards this online retail sector. And this is something that I found that very neat of this paper, is using these footfall changes as a proxy for demand shock in the online retail sector. I think this is very neat, and I found this very, very interesting. Then they show that entrants are less likely to become employers, and that these entrants are also more likely to dissolve. And using all these facts, they are going to present a statistical framework to show that despite this increase in entry, we're going to see that the employment perspectives in the future are going to be worse. We're going to see a reduction in employment because of these changes in the composition. So my comments are going to be around these 4 points. The first one is going to be like, is it entry composition or a business cycle? Then talking about the mechanisms driving from entry, the composition of entry and aggregate employment, and then I have like some smaller comments that probably I won't have time to cover, but we can discuss about them later on. So you talked a little bit about this, but there are very specific shocks driving the business cycle here. So in most of the paper, you're comparing pre-COVID and post-COVID. And pre-COVID, especially in the UK, was driven by the huge surge in uncertainty due to Brexit, because this is more or less the time when this Brexit happened. And post-COVID, we have also a lot of things going on. We had all the bottlenecks, the surge in inflation, the increase in wages. So here in these graphs on the left, we can see this spike in uncertainty in the late 2018, 2019. And then on the right, we can see the wages growth after the earnings growth, after the COVID shock, how it spiked. And then at least the nominal ones remained very large, especially due to inflation. My question is, are the different solution on employment dynamics driven by this rather than by entry composition? So I know you do a little bit already to try to tackle this using in some of these regressions some fixed effects, sector year fixed effects. But I think that what would be neat to at least show at this is to compare this dissolution and employment dynamics of entrants relative to incumbents, because this is really comparing whether it is something going on in the environment that is changing this behavior, or is it really the fact that incumbents are different and they are more likely to dissolve or more likely to create employment? My second question is the mechanism driving from entry. So as I was just saying, I find super neat this footfall shock as a proxy for the demand shock in the online retail sector. And as you were saying, like even though the online retail sector is small, this accounts for 25% of the excess entry. But what happens with the rest of the entry? We have left the 75% of entry that comes from other sectors, and that it's harder to see how this might be linked at least to this footfall shock. If you see here in this graph you presented, actually the second sector that contributes the most to this increase in entry is retail, excluding online. So this is brick and mortar kind of shops. And you even in the paper do this placebo test to show that this footfall has no impact on unrelated industries, and you show this for construction. But we see the increase in construction is relatively large. The increase in real estate is also relatively large. So my question is, what is then driving the increase in entry in these sectors? So I see very clearly the mechanism for the online retail. I would expect the opposite sign for retail excluding online, and then the rest I am not sure. And even when you are doing these regressions with the cumulative firm creation, you see that the blue line is online retail, but the black line is the rest. So footfall is actually able to explain all that from the aggregate. So I'm wondering, like, what are the sectors that are really linked with this footfall other than online retail to explain this increase? So this is something that I was missing, is sort of a lack of a unified explanation for firm entry. I think this is super neat for the online retail, but I'm missing this link to the rest of the economy. Then the composition of entry and aggregate employment. So you were pointing out that entry was tilted towards solo new entrepreneurs. There were many more new entrepreneurs that were solo entering. But the question is why? And I think this is important for understanding the employment prospects that you're having a look later on. So is this because they're fired and this is an outside option? Is it because there are all these new opportunities in this online retail? There are maybe like lower entry cost, there is more access to finance. So I think this is important to think about, especially these employment prospects. And this, at least, I think it's going to be useful to support the uncertainty in the numbers you're going to provide later in firm size. So you acknowledge that there is uncertainty in this firm size because there is not enough data. So I think like having some sort of idea of which kind of firms are the ones that are entering is going to help in this side. So actually, we have a paper with my co-authors that we're looking at Spain. We have survey data, and we show that during COVID, actually the share of necessity entrepreneurs increased, and that low-income entrepreneurs were actually tilting towards low-growth firms. And we do this with survey data. We do also some robustness. So it's true, it's a different country. We actually find some things that are different, but I think this might help at least showing like some suggestive evidence that these firms that are entering are out of necessity and are likely going to be less productive and grow less. But still, yeah, despite this, I think that the fact that you're claiming that it is this shift in composition towards solo entrepreneurs, the one that is driving these changes in employment, might be too much, because as I don't know if you were, there were changes in behavior of corporations that were very important as well. And here, this is the table where you show these changes in aggregate employment by type of firm. So we have the solo new entrepreneurs and the corporations in blue and yellow. So in the last row, you see if we do not change the size of the entrance, because the authors, they acknowledge that there's a lot of uncertainty in these numbers. So it could be the fact that this number is has a lot of uncertainty in it. So if we keep it as it was pre-COVID, actually employment would increase thanks to solo new entrepreneurs. However, for corporations, in all the counterfactual exercises, no matter which counterfactual we do, we're always systematically finding that employment is decreasing. And actually, when we look at the difference in the contribution to the aggregate, it is more than half of this contribution to the negative employment. So I'm wondering whether you can really push that this is a story of changing composition towards solo new entrepreneurs, or is also not only a story about this, but also about changes in the behavior of corporations. And I don't know if you have any idea of why this can be happening, but I think this would be very interesting to explore. And well, I have other comments. I think I don't have much time now, so then we can discuss about these other comments later on. So thank you very much. It was great to read this paper. Thanks.
Thank you, Beatrice. So Federico Rossi is the next, and we need to.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity of discussing the paper, which I really enjoyed reading. So my first slide looks exactly like the first slide of the first discussion, so I think I can save some time by not going through the 5 facts. So there was this big increase in firm entry, which didn't create a lot of employment because of the nature of this new entrance. So before going to my comments, let me just say that I found the paper as a great example of a piece of clear and convincing empirical work. So it is written in a very factual and to the point way, which I really liked. And also, I really appreciated that the results are very transparent in the sense that they can either be directly read from simple summary statistics or easily visualized in graphs. And this is made possible by a very creative combination of many different data sources, all of which have different limitations. But again, the paper is very transparent on this and is very careful not to overclaim when presenting the results. So I think that the main challenge for the paper at this point is really to guide more the reader on what we can learn from the exercise beyond the specific context, beyond the context of the UK, beyond the COVID recession and the specific measure that they're looking at. So this will be the kind of the overarching theme of my discussion. And in particular, I have two thoughts in this direction. First, I'm going to try to frame the paper in the context of a broader literature on recessions with structural reallocation across sectors. I'm going to try to think about what the paper can add to that literature and also what the open issues are. And then I want to talk a bit about the role of the self-employment margin or unincorporated companies. So starting from the first, I think mostly as a consequence of COVID, there has been recently a renewed interest in modeling recessions with uneven shocks across sectors. And a key premise of that literature is that when these shocks are persistent enough, it is desirable for the economy to reallocate some resources from the shrinking sector where demand is low to the growing sector when demand is high. And most of these papers that I'm citing here, I really think about the role of different policy tools, such as monetary policy or labor market insurance, in kind of encouraging this reallocation, and in general, what are the trade-offs in this setting when thinking about optimal policy. For example, if you think about short-term works type of policy, a key concern is that this might hinder reallocation by basically subsidizing unproductive matches in shrinking sectors. In the background of all of this, there is a simple, descriptive, empirical question, which is for a given policy regime, how much reallocation do we see in practice, and in particular through which channels? And I think it's on this question that the paper can really add to this debate. Now, when thinking about labor reallocation as a whole, from a purely statistical point of view, there are different margins through which that can happen. First, it might be that existing firms in sectors where demand is growing are expanding more. So firms that were already in online retail in this case. Second, it might be that existing firms in other sectors partially redirect production to the growing sectors, not necessarily by creating new subsidiaries, but just by selling online, as we've seen during COVID. And I think this type of within firm structural transformation has been documented in the kind of longer run structural change transformation literature for the transition from manufacturing to services. And then there is the entry of new firms to the growing sector. And I see the paper as really a kind of a strong quantification of this third margin. And the takeaway is also quite subtle. On one hand, firm entry can contribute to reallocation, but on the other hand, these marginal firms, these entrants, are very different from typical firms in the sense that they are less likely to grow and hire workers. So I think this finding is kind of consistent, but not identical. To find this from two separate literatures, one that focuses on workers and one that focuses on firms. First, the literature on entrepreneurs by necessity, which is also mentioned by the previous discussant, where the idea is that during bad times or in poor countries, new entrepreneurs are negatively selected in terms of their growth prospects. And then the literature on the cyclical composition of startups, which has a similar message at the firm level. As far as I know, most of these papers, however, don't really think about situations with asymmetric shocks across sectors, and in particular situations where entry is happening in a sector where demand is growing as opposed to shrinking. So by doing that, I think you can kind of provide a bridge by these literatures and the work on kind of recessions with uneven shocks that I was talking about earlier. Now, given this framing, I think it's clear that there are some questions which are outside of the scope of the paper, either for data reasons or others, which are nevertheless important to really create this link with this broader literature. So the first question that I have is how important is this margin, this kind of extensive margin of firm creation relative to other margins of labor reallocation across sectors? So in other words, should we care about these margins alone if our concern is about the aggregate extent of reallocation? Second, kind of related to the policy focus of the literature I was talking about, how does this interact with policy? For example, how did different policies that were aiming supporting jobs in the UK during COVID affect the rate of reallocation across sectors. And here I was wondering, this might be a bit of a tall order, but I was wondering if there could be some scope to use some either time or geographic variation in the incidence of these policies to look at this, perhaps by interacting this with the mobility shock. So to see if a decline in retail mobility would create more firm entry under different policy regimes. Third, why are these new entrants not likely to hire workers? What makes them different? And here I want to echo the previous discussion by saying that I think you stress a lot this ownership structure as a potential driver. I see this as a proximate driver, probably reflecting some deeper factors. And so the question is, what are these deeper factors? Is this about the supply of entrepreneurial talent? So are we seeing kind of the marginal entrepreneur is not that good compared to existing ones? Is it about the type of demand that these firms face that maybe is not really scalable, which is a story that is exploring that literature on startups? Again, difficult to get at this without more data, but I think it's important from a policy perspective. And finally, if you take a kind of a general equilibrium perspective, where are these new entrants coming from? They're coming from unemployment, are there workers in other sectors? And importantly, are they full-time entrepreneurs or do they have other jobs as a side, which seems, anecdotally seem to have happened quite a bit during COVID. And this is important to think about the interaction between the reallocation and unemployment, which is a key concern of that literature I was talking about. Okay, so the other point I want to make is about the self-employment margin, or more precisely, the margin of unincorporated firms. So if I understood correctly, these firms, the unincorporated ones, are not part of the data, of the business registration data. And at the same time, they represent more than half of all UK businesses, around 56%, if I remember right. Moreover, we know that entry into self-employment, or again, unincorporated businesses, is generally counter-cyclical. Here I pulled data from the US just because I could do it more quickly. And I think during recessions, you generally see an increase in self-employment. And in this dimension, the COVID recession does not look that atypical compared to previous ones. So I guess the broad question here is, if we want to think about what happens to business creation as a whole, what about these other firms, which are quite many, as we just seen, and in particular, how do they behave? So is it the case that there is also reallocation of the self-employed to online retail? If that's the case, I think that will probably reinforce this disconnection between firm entry and employment, given that unincorporated firms are likely to be small or less likely to grow over time. But maybe more worryingly for your purposes, might there be some substitution going on between self-employment and incorporation? So in other words, might be the case that some of the firm entry that you see is kind of potential self-employed for some reason during these particular recessions are deciding to incorporate their company. And generally, kind of my broad comment here is that it would be important to have a better understanding of this incorporation margin to really interpret the results, given that you only observe one part of firms, the incorporated ones. So that's all I wanted to say. So overall, great empirical work. And I guess the main suggestion that I have is to try to, to go beyond the kind of the factual style that I was praising in the beginning and try to provide some more guidance to the reader on what we can learn beyond the specific context. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. So we have 15 minutes. I want to leave Sophie some time to respond. Maybe at the end it would be very short. So short comments and questions, please. Okay, Ken?
Yeah, thank you. It's a terrific paper, great discussions. And I'm picking up on a version of the last thing Romain said. First, I want to say that I teach at Harvard, and I think every student I talked to started a company during this period, hired 5 of their friends, claimed they were making money. I really have no idea. But I want to add, I doubt they were reporting it for taxes or reporting it for anything, if they could avoid it. So getting to the unincorporated point, I think the estimates of the World Bank and others who sort of synthesize what the size of the underground economies are, and I've done some work on this very recently myself with Francesco Papada, looking at VAT tax evasion in Europe. So the World Bank estimate is 17% of GDP in advanced economies is underground economy. It's very substantial. So I think there's, potentially a number of margins of things going on exactly in this space. And for example, even the people who incorporate and are reporting, I think are actually hiring a lot of people that they aren't reporting, that's very common. I forget the names of them. There was Amazon Turk originally, and there's a whole bunch of these piecework companies, which are just huge in the United States. And again, everyone, I also know former students who have jobs who still do work for these companies. And again, I don't think they report any of the income. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Aitan.
And congratulations for the paper. I didn't quite get your local projections exercise because if I understood correctly, you were using the time variation, and basically you have a drop in mobility and going back in mobility, and probably that's, to me, I think that probably that's not enough to get the variation to fully pick up the correlation between the birth in online retail and mobility. In particular, I was thinking also that my prior is basically that when you go down the mobility, you may have the idea to get online retail firm, but basically this mobility goes up again very quickly, but the online retail incentive still is there, because there are many people who is still buying online stuff, and that thing was not going down when mobility recovered. So this asymmetry is not captured very well, I guess, in the local projection methodology. So yeah, I was not quite sure of how to get that.
Changjing?
So very interesting paper. So in my mind, firms set up during pandemic may be of very different type. Some could be like the second discussant said, by necessity, or just take advantage of a temporary situation where people couldn't go out to street to shop. Others may use this as opportunity to set up, to move, change their business, really explore newly available online tools. For these different type of firms, end of a pandemic means very different shock. So one implication is that many of the variables you look at might be bimodal or multimodals. So my suggestion is rather than, or maybe in addition to focusing on the means, even the local projection method essentially is look at the means. Could you try to trace the change, evolution, the distribution of the variables? And this will be especially important if it turns out to be bimodal or multimodals. Then perhaps some of the results, you might get a different impression from looking at the distribution rather than the means.
Romain?
So that, yeah, great paper. I liked it a lot. A silver lining from COVID was supposed to be that it would generate one, productivity enhancing reallocation, and second, productivity enhancing entry. And I think your paper speaks to, I think, the growing recognition that none of these effects are basically there, because the sectors that were most hit hired back eventually, and the quality of entry seems to be much less than we thought. And so my question is, however, for the US, right, a number of prominent academics, Chad Severson, John Haltiwanger, have struck a more optimistic tone, at least early in the pandemic. In particular, they highlighted that the share of solo entrepreneurs was actually fairly small. So, it made them fairly optimistic. So the question is, did you try and compare your results with the US? And is there anything that's UK specific in there? I think that speaks also to Beatrice's comments about cross-country differences and UK specificities. Thanks a lot.
So Axel Ferreira is online and she has a question. Can we get her online?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Thanks a lot for taking my question, and sorry for being online. So my question was about, I was wondering whether in the literature, maybe looking at past shocks, is it the case that if you have been entrepreneur once, then you're more likely to become entrepreneur in the future? And therefore, maybe the COVID these new entrepreneurs didn't have a much large effect on employment right now, but maybe this could change a bit dynamics of becoming entrepreneur in the future, and maybe it is more positive than what you stated now. Thanks.
Antonio?
I have two comments. First comment is about the framework. Entrepreneurs can be by necessity because they are locked down. And if there is any way to differentiate between demand and supply of entrepreneurship, because lockdown has double effect. One, it decreases opportunity for people like young student, and at the same time, it creates new opportunity for business. And in your, I wonder whether you can differentiate the demand and supply. Second part is if the shock to demand and supply have a permanent effect. If the new entrepreneurs self-discover that they are good entrepreneurs and stay forever, or the business opportunities are there forever. The other comments I have is that these results echo a work that I'm doing on e-commerce. We have been studying e-commerce in 50 countries to see how permanent was e-commerce after COVID. And the hypothesis was, while people are locked, they learn how to use e-commerce and forever, learning by locking, they stay. We had the title, Learning by Locking. We found nothing. In 57 countries, we found that there is no evidence that after COVID, people, any learning by e-commerce stick, and which is quite interesting and echo what you know, learning by locking, and echo your result.
Ramesh?
Quick question related, I think, to what Ken asked about bogus firms or questionable firms, fake firms. There was a lot of government money around for all sorts of schemes during the early days of the pandemic. So I wonder if you have a sense of how many of these were actually fake firms just set up to take advantage of one of those schemes rather than to actually do any real business.
Thanks. I was actually going to ask this question because in France, we just had a trial exactly on these fake firms, and there were pretty big people getting a lot of money creating artificial firms during COVID. Anyway, so Sophie, you have, I think, 2 or 3 minutes. So pick your questions, pick your comments. You had tons of them, but don't answer them, all of them.
Well, thank you very much. A lot of food for thought, so I obviously won't have time to answer all of the comments, but thanks very much for the 2 great discussions as well. So maybe I will backward the questions and start with the government support question, which I think comes regularly. So actually firms that were starting government support schemes were conditional firms being started before the pandemic. So technically it shouldn't have happened in the UK. There were cases where firms still managed to fake their admin papers. I think there are cases that were tracked, but one way we do to exclude these cases is we exclude postcodes where there were more than 500 registrations for firms within a day, which is the way the UNS deals with these fakes registrations. And actually we do see an increase in the number of postcodes where this happens during the pandemic. So there seems to be some instances where there were fake firms being created, but hopefully we've excluded them from our data. Yes. But unfortunately, that goes up to another question, I think, related to self-employment and actually who are these solo entrepreneurs. And one thing we were really hoping to do is merge, because we have the names of individuals, merge whether they were on furloughs or have the partial unemployment benefits that was offered during the pandemic in the UK. To see whether they changed jobs or whether they returned to their jobs afterwards. And but we don't have this information. We weren't able to get access to the data. So unfortunately, we couldn't investigate. This would have been a great thing to do. And so we don't have much to say on who are these people starting the firms and what industry they were working on and so on. But one thing I can say is that in the US, actually, John Haltinger and Brian Decker presented a new paper on business creation at the Brookings panel a few weeks ago. And one of the discussants, Ben Pugsley, actually documented the parallel rise in self-employment, parallel to the rise in firm creation in the US. Actually that, so it was reinforcing this disconnection exactly between the rise in businesses being created, even unincorporating businesses, and the number of jobs, because he also documents how these self-employed actually employed less people than usual and were smaller than usual. So all very consistent with this story, and also consistent with what we see in the UK. And there was also a question of how that compares in the US and in the UK. And I think in many dimensions, it's a very similar story, where the rise in business, the massive rise in business creation, in online retail. But I think one also now this latest paper by John Haltiwanger Randecker seemed to suggest that these firms are smaller than usual and have a limited employment impact. But I think their optimism lies in the fact that you still see a very strong firm entry in the US, which you don't see anymore in the UK. So it seems to be a bit more permanent in the US than it is in the UK. Whether this hides some informal economy dynamics, I don't have data on this, so I can't answer this question. But it seems, yes, so it seems that the transitory aspects that we really document in the UK, where we don't see new firms recreated in online retail, most of them have already dissolved, and the share of consumption in online versus brick and mortar retail actually reversed to pre-pandemic trends. Maybe this transitory effect is a bit different in the US with more permanent effects. So that would be one of the biggest difference. So I tried to answer a few questions, but thank you again very much for all the discussions. Very useful.
Thank you very much, Sophie. So we now have a second COVID paper, but in a very different dimension. So Max Steinhardt, who is behind me, is going to present the paper.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I have the pleasure to present our paper, Women in Political Power and School Closure During COVID Times. This is joint work with Natalia Danza, Sebastian Garcia Torres, and Luca Stella. Yeah, let me start with a short motivation. So, as we all know, the COVID pandemic prompted various containment and public policy measures. And one of the first and most restrictive containment measures were school closures. And I guess many of you here in the room have been affected also by this, in particular the parents. So what we have observed in Europe is a large variation across countries and over time. So in the beginning, during the first weeks, almost all countries closed their schools, but afterwards we see a lot of variation. So some countries kept their schools closed while others opened. Then when the second phase started, some countries who opened the school were closing it again. So there's a lot of variation we can exploit. Ex post, there's a lot of debates about the benefits and costs of school closures, not only in academia, but also in the policy sphere. And one take-home message that we have so far from the literature is that the largest costs were borne by children and parents, and especially mothers, and among mothers, especially those who are working. What we have relatively little evidence about is about the determinants of school closure. And in particular, one question which pops up, or at least popped us for us, is to what extent is the variation in school closure related to characteristics of policymakers? So this is where our paper kicks in. So the research question which we address is, were female policymakers more or less likely to close schools? The contribution of our paper is that we provide the first study on the role of women in political power in mandating school closure during the COVID-19 pandemic. The method that we have is we have country-level variation and we exploit this variation in the intensity of female representation in national government. So we know for each government the share of female politicians, and we use it in the pre-pandemic year. So if you want to say so, before treatment. The results that we have is we find a negative and significant relationship between female members in national governments and school closures in Europe. We also try to provide some evidence about potential drivers and mechanisms, and the evidence seems to be most consistent with a higher awareness of female politicians about the costs of school closures. What is the literature we contribute to? So the first one is the one studying the impact of female representation in politics on policy decisions. There's evidence for developing countries which shows that indeed female politicians often make different choices than their male counterparts. The evidence for high-income countries is a bit more mixed. So this is one literature we contribute to. Then the second literature is the literature studying the role of female leadership in times of crisis, in particular during the COVID pandemic. And this studies try to understand in how far female politicians were taking different containment measures, or were implementing different containment measures than male politicians. And the third literature is the one on studying the costs and benefits associated with school closure. As I mentioned already at the beginning, there's a large literature which has evolved about the consequences, in particular for children, but also for working mothers and working fathers. And this literature I will comment a bit more in detail in the end when we discuss the implications of our findings. To the data, what kind of data we use? We combine data from different sources, and this allowed us to create a weekly panel for the EU27 member states plus the UK. It covers the period from March 1st, 22 to September 30, 21. And it is a balanced set of more than 2,000 country-by-week observations. The main outcome of interest that we have is school closure. This data is provided by the Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker. So a very nice database which contains several harmonized measures on COVID outcomes and COVID containment measures. And the variable we use is a dummy variable and is coded as 1 if all schools are required to close in a given week and country. The main explanatory variable is the share of female members of national governments in each country in the 4th quarter of 2019. So as I said, pre-pandemic. So because in principle, it could be that the share of representation is endogenous to the pandemic. So it could be that due to the pandemic, the gender composition in governments changes. So we use the composition in 2019. The data is provided by the Gender Statistics Database of the European Institute for Gender Equality. There's also a lot of variation. So the mean is 31%, and the lowest representation is 9%. The largest is close to 60%. So 60% of members in national government were female. And in the regression results I will present in a minute, we express this variable in units of standard deviation to ease interpretation. So what is the model that we have? It's a very simple model. It's a linear probability model. The outcome of interest is, as I said, school closure of country C in week T. So we have variation in the share across countries for the females, and we also have on a weekly basis, we have the school closure. Then we have women in government, the share of female members of national governments in country C in the 4th quarter of 2019. Then we also, of course, have a control for the COVID cases. So here we take the average number of cases per 100,000 people, also varying on a weekly basis. And then we have a bunch of control variables that we include, which are potential confounders. So this is, for example, the female labor force participation rate, or the GDP per capita, broadband internet. So these are things where we assume that they also might have an influence on the likelihood of school closure in a given country. And then we have weak fixed effects. Standard errors we cluster at the country level. An important note, which we also emphasize in the paper, we do not have any exogenous country level variation in female representation. So we cannot exploit any kind of exogenous shock or exogenous change. So therefore we do not claim that our estimates are causal, but we try our best to provide something which goes beyond a simple correlation exercise. And I hope to convince you in the end that you think we are on a good way, or we tried the best what we can do. Okay, these are the main results here. So in column 1, we have a very parsimonious specification without controls, without weak fixed effects. And then, as you see, stepwise, we add controls, the ones I mentioned in column 2. Then in column 3, we add COVID cases. And in column 4, we then also have weak fixed effects. And you see that in all cases, we get a negative and significant coefficient of similar size. And the interpretation would be that an increase in the share of females in government by 1 standard deviation, is associated with a decrease in the probability of school closure by approximately 5.7 percentage points, which corresponds to approximately 24% of the mean. So significant, also in economic terms, effect or correlation that we find here. Then in the next step, we try to check for potential confounders. So potentially our results could simply reflect country differences in gender norms, right? Gender norms and culture. So countries with a lot of females in government, they might also have a different gender norm, and this might drive the effect. But we do not have any evidence for this, because when we include gender norms or also region fixed effect, the results do not change. The next potential explanation could be that it is driven by higher vaccination rates or differences in worries about COVID-19. So if there are fewer worries about COVID-19 and also higher vaccination rates, there might be a less need of containment measures. So it might be not so important to close schools. When we look on this, we also do not find evidence on this. Yeah, so we include here vaccinations against COVID. And in the second column, we also include public sentiments using Google Trends. And again, we find very similar estimates like in the benchmark specification. Another interpretation or another potential problem could be that it is not so much about females in political power. It is maybe just generally reflecting a situation that women in decision-making positions like media, business, and finance are important. So is it really politics which drives our result, or could it be something else? We try this here in this specification where we look on the share of females in different areas. Here, women in the share of females in media, the share of females in Supreme Court, in research funding institutions, in business. And for none of these different female representation areas, we find a significant effect. Of course, we also have several robustness and sensitivity checks. We run Logan and Probit models. We bootstrap standard errors. We also distinguish between the first and second period. And yeah, the results are pretty robust. And due to the limited time, I will skip this and do not comment on the different things we do in the paper. More interesting will be the potential explanations and mechanisms. So one potential explanation could be that the result reflect differences in characteristics of female and male politicians. So it could be, for example, that female politicians are overrepresented in left-leaning parties, and these parties were less likely to close schools, potentially. We tried to check this, and the results you see here. So in this specification in column 2, we include controls for the political orientation. We also check whether the people have children or not. We control whether the education minister was female, and we do not find any significant differences. Another thing could be that females are in general more reluctant to implement containment measures. So it's not about school closure. It's the case that females in general are more reluctant to implement containment measures and also strict measures. So we looked on different, how we frame it, gender neutral containment measures. So face coverings, restrictions on gatherings, closing public transport, restrictions on international movements. And for none of these outcomes, we find any significant effect. Yeah. In column number 5, we have a different outcome, which is called the stringency index, which is some kind of composite measure, how strong the measures on overall were, which were implemented. And again, we do not find any evidence that the share of females in government matters here. So we do not find any significant relationship between women in government and gender-neutral COVID policy. So it seems to be really about school closure. So finally, could the results be driven by gender differences in political preferences of policymakers? I mentioned the evidence, the literature already in the beginning, and yes, we have some kind of suggestive evidence, and I want to share this with you. So if it's really the case that there are differences in political preferences and identity between female and male politicians, then we would expect that this, the effect is larger in countries with a high maternal labor force participation and a high childcare enrollment. So countries where, simply speaking, a lot of mothers are working and many children are in public childcare. And indeed, we have evidence for this. So this is now the breakdown of our sample in 2 different parts. The first one is with a low maternal labor force participation and low childcare enrollment, and the other is with a high. And you see that the effect is more pronounced and also statistically different in the sample with a high maternal labor force participation and high childcare enrollment. To dig deeper into this mechanism, we looked for microevidence. So we wanted to know whether is there any microevidence on policymakers and their decisions during the pandemic, which would be in line with the macro findings that we have. The situation was, as you all know, that during the COVID-19, it was a state of emergency, and the power shifted from governments, from parliaments to governments, and the role of the parliaments was really limited. So we checked for voting on this issue, so voting on school closure, and we were not able to find any parliamentary action on this in Europe. So in no country there was any kind of voting whether the school should be open or not. What we then did, we looked for questions asked in parliament. And in the German parliament, the good thing is that each parliamentarian, irrespective whether he or she belongs to the governing party or not, can ask questions on certain issues which he or she finds very important. And so we did this for the first year, so starting from February 28, 2020 to February 28, 21. And this were overall more than 7,000 questions, individual questions by parliamentarians asked. And then we used text analysis techniques to identify questions related to school closure. And we also collected information on the characteristics of politicians, so whether their gender, whether they have children, and whether they have which party they belong. And the question we wanted to know was, were women more likely to ask questions related to school closure? Because if this is the case, then this is a clear indication that the awareness of school closure and the negative consequences would be more pronounced, as we would expect. So these are the aggregate figures. So the share of females in the German parliament is less than 1/3. And when we look on the written question, then we see that women are a bit more active. Yeah, they ask more questions. So 41% of questions are asked by female parliamentarians. And when we look on the written questions about school closure, then we see that 65% were asked by a female politician. So this already is some kind of pattern which goes in line with our argument. And then we also ran some regressions. First of all, we ran a regression on all parliamentarians in the German Bundestag. These are 752 individuals, and the dependent variable is if at least one question was about school closure. And here we find indeed a very large and statistically significant effect, meaning that female parliamentarians were indeed more likely to ask at least one question. When we change the unit observation, this is panel B, and we now look on all questions asked, so the 7,000, then again we find that it is more likely that a question on school closure was asked if the parliamentarian was female. And we see this as evidence for the last mechanism that I mentioned, that the results are indeed could be driven by gender differences and political preferences. So what are the potential implications of our work? So if we make now the assumption or the thought experiment that our relationship is causal in nature, then a higher female representation would have caused fewer school closures. So what would this imply for the health and socioeconomic outcomes of children, families, and the society in general? So first, let's look on health outcomes. So the evidence on the benefits of school closures as a contagion measure is rather mixed. Now, there are several studies who find negative effects. So this would be in line with the argument which was used to close schools, so to prevent the spread of the disease. But then there are also several papers who do not find any significant effects or even positive effects. And in particular, I want to emphasize the paper from Bismarck and Austin, because this was also presented here in this economic policy panel last year. So the evidence is mixed. So therefore, it's unclear whether fewer school closures would have had a negative effect on health outcomes of vulnerable groups. On the other hand, there's growing evidence of the negative effect on children, in particular mental health of children. So the negative mental health impact on children could have been lower under a more equal gender representation in politics if we assume that our effect is causal in nature. What about the implications for education and labor markets? There's growing evidence now, several papers popping up on substantial negative effects of school closures on cognitive skills of children. In particular, those from families with a low social background. children with single parents, or children of ethnic and racial minorities. So the negative effect of cognitive skills is very unequally distributed. There's also evidence on labor market outcomes, a negative effect on labor market outcomes, in particular on labor market participation of females, of working mothers who reduce the time they work or even drop out of their job. And there's also some studies looking on the long run consequences, in particular income inequality and intergenerational mobility, among others, the paper by Nicola Vogt-Schündel, which was also presented here last year in the Economic Policy Forum. So these negative consequences on education and labor market outcomes could have been partly mitigated with a higher representation of females in governments. So let me conclude. So what we do in the paper, we study the relationship between female representation in politics and school closure during the COVID-19 pandemic in Europe. Our key finding is that there's a negative relationship between the share of female members in national governments and school closures. We find the association goes in the direction that one standard increase in the share of females in governments is associated with a decrease in the probability of school closure by almost 6 percentage points. And the potential channel that we find most consistent with our results is a higher awareness of female politicians about the potential costs that school closure imply for families. And in terms of policy implications, which we might discuss more in detail after the presentation, our study highlights the importance of gender balance in policy making, especially in times of crisis like the last COVID pandemic was. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. So the first discussant is Laura Ospido, and I guess we need the... Don't throw it.
Okay, so first of all, thanks for giving me the opportunity to read this paper. As Federico said before, I mean, this time, I mean, it has been really a pleasure to read these papers because they are so well written. I mean, they are super clear, they are super transparent, and indeed they are also very honest in their approach. I guess that having previous referees also helps on this. So indeed, I mean, I don't have as many comments, and also there is another discussion coming after me. Let me say that. But in any way, I will try to do my best. Maybe not. Okay. So I still give you the one slide summary, although, I mean, Max has been so clear in his presentation, they don't need like 3 palette. So what they do is they use this data from 28 European countries. And what they do is documenting this negative relationship between the share of women in political power. So really here is share of women in governments and the likelihood of school closure in the respective country during the COVID pandemic. Okay. In terms of quantifying this relationship, the idea will be that they get is a substantial effect. So is this one standard deviation increasing the share of female members? And this one standard deviation is like moving from, you know, some country like Portugal to Denmark in the share of women. So it's not that incredible amount. This is associated with a 5.7 percentage point reduction in the likelihood of a school closure. And this is not an event that is so common. So this is 24% of relative to this average share of a school closure. And then what is more interesting, I guess, is trying to understand what is behind this negative impact. So they also have this subjective evidence that this seems to be associated with, well, this seems to be larger in countries where there is a higher maternal employment and higher childcare enrollment. Okay, or this idea of countries where, in general, I guess one politician are more aware of the cost that this school closure could have. So my comments are related with I have one comment that is associated to this fact of being honest. They have been already super honest in the paper, but I will be even more honest. And I give you one suggestion for why I think that this could help to the reader, okay? And then they also do, they are completely aware of this, what I'm going to tell you, so this is nothing new for them. They are aware of that, or the referees are aware of that as well. But even though, I mean, I will be even more honest about that. And then, given that, they also do their best on offering, a battery of robustness in the sense of trying to convince us what they are finding, this correlation, as indeed very, robust. Or it is difficult to think that it's related to something else, okay? But on that, I will still try to offer you a couple of more possible tests, although, I mean, maybe this is not adding huge on this because they already have a lot. But I also like to think of these two additional tests as a way of understanding what is going on. But on that, I'm not that sure. So let's keep them as a robustness test, and then we can discuss. So for me, the very nice starting point of the paper is this figure that Max didn't show us before, but described in words. And is this figure on the evolution of over time of this school closure on this sample of 28 countries, okay? So the number of countries that were really closing the schools at each point in time, these are weeks from the beginning of the pandemic to the end. So, and they motivate the paper as, we are trying to understand the reason why there is this variation, because as you can see at the beginning, more or less every country was closing, or, of the sample, a lot of them were closing. We have 28, so 24 out of 28 were closing. But then over time, you see, there were, of course, difference in the incidence of the pandemic in these countries, but there were also a lot of variation on the incidence of these closures. So this question is really in the introduction of the paper, and they claim this. What are the reasons for this variation across countries and over time? So in this exercise of honesty, I will say that this paper, I think that helps a lot or really is giving us a credible explanation of why there is this variation across countries, but less so over time. And this slide is so similar to yours, to the 6 that we are using the same, but it's not exactly the same. So it's just to give you an idea again of the empirical approach. So this is this linear probability model that they use, where they have this dummy variable that is really whether at each week and country the schools were closed or not. And then our main independent variable is this women in government, this share of women in government. But here we only have this variable in a given point in time. Okay, so then on many of our controls, we have variation over time. Well, not that many, really, the only in the average number of cases and time effects. But then everything else is just in a given point in time. So this is the honesty point. So for me, it's really hard to think that, we can explain the time variation with really using this only cross-sectional evidence that is coming from 28 countries. So on this, I will be even more, honest in the sense that you even have this graph of the this scatter plot, where you are really offering like duration of closures relative to, this share of women in a given point, the point that we have, this 4th quarter of 2019 over countries, okay? So why don't do that just to begin with, in the sense of, okay, let's take this correlation that this is coming from 28 points, it's fine, it's negative, it's clear. Also take into account the covariance that we can do and see whether this is still the case. I'm sure that is going to be the case, but be very explicit about really our source of variation is just coming from that. And indeed, I mean, if you want to do a bit more on this, in the sense that this idea of the overtime, maybe you can do this in the two important sub-periods, okay? So you do this, the duration at the beginning, the duration where things get a bit more messy over time, okay? Then thinking on the mechanism, or whether knowing what is going on, for me, I see non-linearities everywhere, okay? So let me say this to begin with. But for me here, I really wanted to understand what these politicians were able to get in these decisions. And for me, it's very hard to think that if you only have 9% of women relative to 10, 12, that really their incidence will be linear, okay? So in a government where you have really half of the women, I can see that the dynamics could be super, super different in terms of decision-making than when you only have 10%. So this is something that I will also test, some non-linearities on this, the impact of this share of women. Again, to trying to understand why the decision-making is different. And then the other thing that I will check as well is this, you were checking heterogeneity by with policy cycle or government cycle. So how close or distant were from the election point of, and then there were no difference on that. But for me, it was more in terms when you say at the beginning close election, I was thinking really on close in terms of results. Okay, so I can imagine that the importance of the kind of measures that you can take is going to be very different in governments that they are sure that they are going to win again, or no matter what they do, or relative to the previous election, they can anticipate that they probably won't be that penalized. That we in other governments would, I mean, they are there, but most likely they won't repeat, or who knows whether they will be able to repeat or not. And associated to this will be a problem in, there is something that makes that for those governments that they have a higher chance to be re-elected, they in practice, they also have fewer women among them. And they also have this, bigger willingness to take unpopular measure if you think that it was clearly unpopular, but, whether this school closure can be think as unpopular, okay? And this is all. So thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to read it. Enjoy.
Thank you. Jan Stuhler.
Yeah. Good. Okay. Yeah, that was a great paper to read. It's very clear. It's also very short, which is always nice to read a paper that's very short. So thanks for that. I don't want to spend too much time on the paper itself. As Laura said, it's very, very clear. It's very easy to understand. It's an interesting question, very clear focus, clear analysis, very well written. So I think there's sort of very little in terms of the presentation that's not positive, so to say. But of course, we do these discussions to kind of point at things that are maybe worth discussing. And before I do that, I just want to show you what are we talking about in terms of a map. So this is kind of the variation we're working with, right? Across countries, number of weeks of school closures. This is early in the pandemic. And then the next graph is sort of later in the pandemic. And so I think you pointed out in the paper, while early in the pandemic, there was not so much variation. Later in the pandemic, countries really started to have different strategies, and some closed schools much more than others. Okay, so kind of that's the variation we're working with, although the variation we're working with is in Europe, right? It's the 28 countries in Europe. And I think kind of, Laura, you took a bit of time to say, look, I really have to talk about this because this is an issue. And of course, it's also one of the main things that I want to talk about in my presentation. So this is coming up twice. So kind of the elephant in the room here is the number of observations, right? I mean, we have 28, effectively, we are working with 28 observations, 28 countries. And then, we want to control for sort of this, in the paper, you say wide range of county level characteristics. And so you have these 8 control variables that you want to control for, which I think is a very good idea. But yeah, so we have 28 observations. We have lots of control variables that we want to use. And so that's kind of, in my view, is kind of clearly sort of the limitation of this paper that we're working with. The question I would have is why? Like, why only the EU 28 countries? I mean, the data on school closures is worldwide, so that is not a limitation. I guess the limitation comes from what information you have on sort of the gender composition of national governments. I'm wondering that the data source that you use is European Institute for Gender Equality. They do seem to have more data than just the 28 countries. So if you could expand it a bit more, at least there, because I think anything you could do to really increase the sample size here would really strengthen the paper. There's sort of like a short technical note that I don't want to bore you a lot with, but the idea is that, okay, if we have 28 clusters, 28 observations, then actually showing these robust or cluster robust standard errors, they're going to be downward biased. So you might want to sort of take this a bit more explicitly into account, and that might shave off a significant star here or there, although I think the differences should be relatively minor, and the result stands, of course. So the strategy is selection of observable strategy, and there's kind of, I found really interesting, you have the sentence caution against the causal interpretation. And of course, many papers do this. They kind of have the sentence saying, okay, we have to be careful, this selection of observable strategy. But you're really sort of strongly saying, okay, we shouldn't interpret this causally. And that's a bit strange, because isn't that kind of the goal here, right? And to some extent, reading also through the referee reports, I mean, my impression is you have convinced the referees, and hopefully also many of the audience today, that this is probably causal. Okay, so despite the small number of observations, like with all these additional tests that you're doing, I think you can be a little bit more forceful that that maybe the causal interpretation is not completely alien here. So you do have lots of robustness tests in the paper, an extensive set of county characteristics. What I was wondering more is other characteristics of members of the government itself. So there you don't do so much, you do something about political orientation. The thing that really comes to my head is something like age. So women's representation in politics is increasing, and that's of course partly comes from young politicians who are more likely to be women. And so maybe that's kind of the first control that would come to my mind to put in there. I really like table 4, where you show this, compare different types of levels of government. I would mention that show early on, and also really liked what you showed today on these questions in German parliament. I can't remember having seen that in the paper, which means that either I'm blind or it's new. You say it's new. Okay, great. So this is, I think this really also strengthens the interpretation of the paper. Some minor points. The paper is about national governments. Doesn't fully become clear to me what exactly is national government. These are ministers and what else is part of it. And then actually in the presentation today, it was very clear, but in the paper I found it not so clear. In the paper, you kind of introduce the topic of school closures in a way as if this is clearly a bad thing, right? You sort of emphasize the literature on effects on educational outcomes, on effect on psychological outcomes. But of course, there was a reason why we closed all those schools. And actually today in the presentation was very clear that there's pro and contra. And I think it's kind of interesting to keep this in mind. I mean, in theory, one could write the same paper with a completely different framing, the framing being that female politicians do not protect public health, right? So there's this question of whether school closures were important or not is, I think, interesting. In the presentation today, it was very good. And of course, you do have the right perspective there. I think the point is simply that whatever the costs and benefits, the costs are predominantly for families with young children. And I think that's all you need to make your argument. Some more general comments. Yeah, I think sort of the general literature, I think what's kind of clear is it's not so useful here to look at raw correlations, right? So this sentence is not from your paper, it's from another paper, but sure, these raw correlations between what is the female share in government and what is the outcome of a particular country, that's far too coarse to really interpret causally. And so we really need to have this sort of selection on observable strategy at least, which you do. In terms of contribution, one issue that you have is that there are already a few papers looking at that. And so when you kind of, in the introduction now, when you say what's sort of special about your paper relative to other papers, you emphasize that, well, while these other papers, they look at a country's leader, you look more generally at the share of females, share of women in government. That, to me, sounds not such a great argument. And I think you actually have much better arguments in your paper. There's a lot of stuff that you do, for example, this table 4, what you showed today on questions in German parliament. I think sort of this, whether we look at a binary version of female representation or like a continuous version, that to me strikes me as more like a minor difference. And I think there are other aspects of the paper that are more interesting. Final comment regarding research question. I mean, you sort of focus on the mean in the sense of, are there school closures or not in these countries? I'm wondering if you want to also connect a little bit more on how unequal these school closures were. Because my impression is that this was actually also a big topic, right? We have evidence that these school closures, they hit different groups very differently. They were much more, in some countries, they were much more frequent in poorer regions. They hit ethnic minorities much more. So we have good evidence in that. And one interesting question I think to ask would be whether female leaders were also better in kind of maybe keeping these distributional consequences down, rather than just closing schools less often in general. I don't know if that's possible. That's, of course, you would need data on sort of these sort of regional imbalances or imbalances of groups. But given that there are quite a few papers on that, maybe it's possible to get data out. So yeah, very nice paper. And thanks for having me as a discussant.
Thank you. So we can open the discussion. You don't. Anyway, okay, go ahead, Miguel.
Thanks. Very nice paper. I just had a comment. As you were speaking, I was thinking about other dimensions that might be relevant, and one of the dimensions I thought was left-right. And you showed some results, but I think you were just doing a horse race between the share of women in government and the left-right. Could you do that whole table? I think it's table 5 in the paper with interactions to just see what's kind of the additional effect of these other dimensions on top of the share of women. I think that would be informative to understand how relevant these channels could be on top of the share of women in government. Thanks.
Romain?
Thanks a lot. Just wanted to come back to, of course, what's the main concern now with the paper, which is omitted variable bias. I think there were already lots of great suggestions from the two discussants, but let me add. No, one issue I see is the share of women representation in power. It correlates really well with broader sets of values in societies that may themselves correlate really well with the likelihood of school closures during COVID, such as, for example, the degree of civism in society, which is going to affect the extent to which mask and distancing mandates are likely to be respected, correlates with religion, because let's be concrete, right? Which are the countries that have high versus low, women represented in power? Take, say Sweden versus Italy, right? And the big difference is, between the two countries, it's degree of civism really differs, religion differs, and other things differ. So I think you could control beyond gender norms. I think you could, by the way, control for broader norms that are captured in things like World Value Survey. People have done that for a long time. And actually, my point on civism was just based on a factual question in the World Value Survey along the lines of whether it's fine to collect a benefit that you're not entitled to. And the answer really differs between Sweden and Italy. And alternatively, or as a complement, you could also try to look at not just school closure, but the likelihood of using school closure as opposed to other restrictive measures. Because, you would expect that some of the things I just mentioned are going to affect the likelihood of being restrictive in general. Right? Sweden was much more liberal in its approach to COVID restriction than other countries, but maybe it was actually, even more liberal on the school closure. So you could use the difference between school closure and an indicator of stringency of other measures as a dependent variable. And finally, I think this makes me think that it would be really nice to do this analysis within a country like a federal country where school mandates are actually school closures, are decided by local officials. And the US is of course a very good example where you could see a lot of cross-state variation, along very much political lines, but maybe there were gender lines as well. So it would be very nice. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so 2 Italians are next, Antonio and Roberto.
Thank you. Very good paper. Our Prime Minister is a woman, by the way. Apart from I wonder if you can use the same framework to see vaccination rate, because that would address part of the issue raised, in the sense that if there was a higher vaccination rate with more women in power. And the second is that, did you control also about sometimes, at least in Italy, women are Minister of Health. So that could be also the composition of power could be interesting.
Two questions. The first one on the specification. So I don't remember when I saw the paper, if you play with interactions between the intensity of the pandemic and the share of women. That would be interesting. A lot of issues of endogeneity, but still discretely it would be quite interesting to understand if there is some differential reaction to the intensity. And the second one, so there is something that, there is something in the end that you sort of presenting something interesting, quite sexy, but we don't really go up to what we can exploit. And so seems to suggest that there are differences in political preferences, but it's not really clear, is that? I wonder if you can't, within Germany, exploit more the content and sentiment analysis, and not only just the word counting or whatever, in the questions in the parliament, to see whether contents and sentiments are different between the men and women. And that's so there are a lot of techniques that you can take on the shelves from sociology, and it would be quite nice to to extend the paper in this direction to give credibility. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So just, I think it's interesting to finish the paper with this discussion about the consequences. It's useful, I guess, to kind of broaden the paper. On those consequences, there is something that I think you did not mention, which is on economic outcomes in the short run. You focused a bit more on the long run, but in the short run, having the schools open also let the parents work, which might be important in particular in those countries in which the participation of women to the labor market is high. So it's not completely orthogonal to what you're doing, and I think it might be useful to mention this as well.
So it's just a short question related to the question about the gender of the health minister. I don't know if you have information about the gender of the leaders of the teachers union. In some countries, there were negotiations between the government and the teachers union to close the school. So I don't know if that could be something that you can add.
And there are two questions, Francesco and Tommaso.
Yeah, thanks. So very quick, because many of the points I wanted to make have already been made by another question. So I wanted to reiterate on one point that Jan has raised in his discussion, which I think is, I believe it may be crucial. So the age dimension, right? So like you're talking about women in power, but if we have young leaders, perhaps you would get the same. I don't know. I mean, this seems to be a crucial distinction. So basically, politicians who have school-age children versus those who don't. And yeah, I wonder how that would look like.
And so I also had a comment on the specification, which I guess the interaction between the COVID with the country fixed effect would be the way of convincing better the audience of what you find. And then I have a comment on, there is plenty of, at least in Italy, there was a plenty of regional variation in, so school closure were decided at the regional level. So another way of having more than 28 points. And the decision was different between for primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and which would give you a lot more variation. You performing your same exercise and lots of anecdotes. So we had a governor in Italy, the longest closure was in Campania in the Naples region, where there is a governor who is a male and pretty old that was making fun of the kids who want to go to school. And so I think that there's a lot of, by seeing your paper, I immediately thought about this guy who couldn't understand why school closure was an issue, because it was not an issue for him. So,
Okay, go ahead.
So I have a question about what is your take about the mechanisms? And I want to follow up on Jan's comment that, school closures can be positive or negative, depending on whether you look at labor force participation or health issues. And you have a graph in the paper where it seems that this women effect is early enough in the pandemic, but then it's like not really such an issue. So could it be disagreement, or do you have any idea or any take on what could be driving the differences between?
Okay, and I have also a question on the time dimension. So I understand it's difficult to use this time dimension, and in some sense it's a limit certainly of the paper, but I was wondering to what extent you could, for example, interact your variable, which is at the country level, and the number of cases to understand maybe a bit more the mechanism, to what extent it's the fact that women have a different view on the trade-off, potential trade-off between the negative and positive impact of school closures. Also, there's been a lot of talk, and I think you mentioned it, about the psychological cost for children, and I'm pretty sure you can find some time dimension on this, the number of times it's been talked about on Google or in the press, and to understand to what extent maybe women are indeed more alert to this type of issue. And the same thing for jobs, that working from home is maybe was more difficult for women than for men. And this again is something that has a time dimension. So interacting your country level coefficient on women and this time dimension could help, not maybe persuading us about the causality, but giving us more information about the mechanism behind what you find in your results. So you have 5. No, not that bad. You have 5 or even 7 minutes to respond to these different questions and comments.
Yeah, thank you a lot for all this very constructive comments and feedback, in particular the two discussants who read the whole paper and made their thoughts how to further improve it and how to put it into context. Yeah, let me comment on some of them. So of the comments. So one argument was whether we have checked whether the effect varies with the intensity, and we did, and we do not find that the effect varies across the intensity of the pandemic. Of course, the question is always what kind of measures to use, but we tried different ones and we have not found evidence on this. And I'm not sure that this is somewhere hidden in the appendix, but I agree that this is an important point and we should emphasize it more. Another point was whether we could better or more explore the microdata that we now collected, and I totally agree that the results that we presented there were based, so the text analysis was really used so far only to identify the questions related to school closure, and we could do much more. And we could also look on all the other bills potentially, and also try to understand in how far females and males have different views on and sentiments on this issue. Regarding the age dimension, this was mentioned by Jan and also by Tommaso, and I think also another person. Indeed, we are now I think we almost finished the data collection on the senior ministers and their background, so we know whether they have children. We also know, I think, their age, and so far we have not explored, but we definitely can do, and this is, I think, an important point. So both aspects, whether how young are the politicians and whether they have children, and also how old the children are. So if there's someone where the children are not in school anymore, then this might differ a lot from a politician with children who already work. Regarding gender norms, so there was a comment that we could do more on the norms. So there might be a lot of variation across countries regarding other norms and gender norms. We did this, so we indeed tried also with other norms, but I think we have not tried the ones you mentioned, so we can do this. This is possible. Vaccinations as an outcome would be super interesting. I agree. We could use the same framework potentially and collect the data and then run the regression and see whether we also find an influence of female representation on the extent of vaccination across countries. Then we had some comment on nonlinearities. I'm not so sure that we can address it or how can we address it with the data that we have, but for sure there are some things we could try, and I agree that maybe we can try with some thresholds or some concentrations, and so I agree that this is potentially an interesting aspect, and I agree also that it might make a difference how large the concentration is. And I also like the suggestion that we could look on total weeks in the first step, right, to aggregate the data up, and then we can split it into periods. So this would be also something we definitely could do. The comment of Jan, why only 28 countries in the gender database are 36? Yeah, fair point. Indeed, at some point we do not want to get the comment that it's our country selection is arbitrary. So we wanted to focus on the EU. And the good thing with the EU is that all the data is available in a harmonized format so that the data is really comparable. For the other countries, it's sometimes difficult to get the data on school closure is not comparable sometimes. Then there are missing observations on the gender composition or important control variables or potential confounders are missing. But potentially we could try. So we could try, at least for robustness, we could extend the sample and see whether the results still hold. Yeah, the comment with the standard errors, fair point. We can try this. The results, at least with bootstrapping, are pretty similar, but we should take the HC3 standard errors then. And collecting more information on the government or the type of government and then trying to condition on this or doing some interactions is also possible. Yeah, so I think many of the comments you raised imply a lot of additional data collection, but this is fine. We're happy to extend our data set, and I think this is also one contribution, maybe, that we now provide harmonized data on this important topic, which can be used for other purposes like looking for vaccination rates or other things. So thank you a lot for all these constructive comments, and yeah, thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have a half-hour break before we reconvene for the policy session and the China paper by Ken.